Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of my YouTube channel. Today I wanted to cover the very basic of all basic things to know about Access, and it's what you need to know when you're a new user contemplating using Access for a project, what you need to know before you even take the dive. It's the essential information, just packaged up, grouped together here quickly. This isn't going to be an extremely long presentation, but the high level, what you should know about Access. What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? What do you need to know to make sure that you're at least starting off on the right foot, that Access is the right product for the project at hand? Let's dive in. What is Microsoft Access? Well, Microsoft Access is actually two tools in one. You have the database, tables, constraints, indexes, relationships, which is common throughout, the realm of relational database management systems. You think of MySQL, Oracle, Postgre, this is what a database is. But typically, to work with any of these other databases, then you need to have some third-party tool. For SQL Server, you think of SSMS. For MySQL, very commonly, it's PHPMyAdmin, and that's where you're able to go and create queries. And then add to that, if you want to create an interface now for your users, you now have to have another language, PHP, .NET, C++, whatever, to develop some type of interface for your users to actually be able to use. And it gets more complicated because most often your reporting will be done in something like HTML. Access already offers that basically all in one, because you also get a RAD development tool. You get a query designer. Actually, you get more than one. You get the ability to create forms, reports, and you even have automation. So you have macros and VBA. And it's all integrated together seamlessly. And that's what made Access stand out originally when it was first released back in the 80s. It was simply unparalleled. Nothing came close to it. And in reality, even today, it remains an awesome prototyping tool. You can pop out some proof of concept forms or reports very quickly to illustrate the direction you want to go in, and it's something I do quite often with my clients, before even having to get into developing tables, before having to do any code. You can pull out very quickly demos and things like that. Then we get into, well, how do we properly set up a database? We create one. What do we need to know about setting up the infrastructure? Well, this is one of the biggest issues with Access. People, new users, aren't aware of, don't properly understand. IT departments just don't grasp it. But an Access database to be used properly, especially multi-user databases, they have to be split. They have to be broken into two. There's a command. I have a video about database splitting. They have to be split. It's not an option. It is a requirement. The database must be split into a backend, which goes on a share, on a server, a central location that everyone has access to. And the backend is your tables, your data. And then your front end, which is your graphical interface, your forms, reports, and code. That then has to be distributed a separate individual copy to each user on their local machine. You don't want this running over the network. You want it on their local PC, in their documents, on their desktop, or some other folder of your choosing, but it has to be local to that PC. None of these roaming profiles. It has to be local. And this is one of the big misconceptions, because when you initially create a file in Access, it's a singular file. So Microsoft are already setting you up to a certain extent down the wrong path. It needs to be split. It should be something you do pretty early on in reality, well before deploying it. I'm talking during the development cycle. Talking about proper setup, the proper permissions is you have to give full permissions to users on both the folder that houses the backend and the folder that houses the front end. So you have to give read permission, write permission, and delete permission. And the reason being, Access creates what's called a lock file when it's being used. So you have to be able to create that file, you have to be able to edit that file, and you have to be able to delete it when you close the database. And that's why you need full permissions. Next, what do you need to consider about Access in your network environment, and what are the requirements? What is it capable of? Well, at a core, Access can handle somewhere between, in my experience, 20 to 50 users simultaneously. We're talking simultaneous here. Yes, theoretically, you're going to find papers, specifications from Microsoft that say 255. It's baloney. It just can't. I know some people have pushed beyond 50, 80. I believe I've even heard of someone doing 100. This entirely depends on your network. If you've got a slow, saturated network, well, then your number may even drop below 20. If you've got a peppy, fiber optic network, your switches are a high-speed gigabit, you've got the ideal setup, things are smooth, well, then you'll be able to go above 50 users. I've done so. But just keep in mind that ballpark, 20 to 50 users, is probably the sweet spot for Access. You have a limit for an Access database, each file, of 2 gigabytes. Now that's a hard limit. There is no flexibility on that. When your file goes above 2 gigs, it's done. It's fried. You've corrupted your database. So that's why I put, when you get to about the 1.2, the 1.5 gig, you seriously need to be figuring things out and fast. And then you start thinking, oh, well, I can split it possibly. I can put some tables in one backend and some tables in another. Yes, it's an option, but then you lose referential integrity and things like that. Then you also start thinking about upsizing. Maybe SQL Server Express is the route I should be going, or full-fledged SQL Server, Azure, PostgreSQL. That's when you start looking at what are the other options and database systems available to me to get around that limit. I must also say, in all my years of development, all my clients, I have never once come close to hitting a 2 gig limit. The cases that I've seen where we've had issues with 2 gig limits is when I've been called in to clean up other developers' work. You think of a database housing text, data entry, dates, things like that. Hitting 2 gigs of text is huge. It's enormous. If you do proper development, that limit is pretty much inconsequential. But at the same time, Microsoft, with certain recent changes and certain things that have been done, have enabled users now to do all sorts of things that you can, if you're not knowledgeable, hit the 2 gig limit pretty easily. The other consideration being Access is meant to be run on a hardwired LAN network. I don't know what else to say about it. That is a fact. So that implies you're not supposed to run it over a wireless network. You're not supposed to run it over a VPN. Certainly not over a WAN. You shouldn't be running off of a SharePoint document library. You should not be running it on online shares, OneDrive, Google Drive, Dropbox, you name it. And when it comes to NAS drives, be careful. They're not all created equal. I have clients where it runs very, very smoothly. And I also have other ones where it would not run properly on the NAS. The second we took it off the NAS and put it on another PC, it was a drastic night and day performance difference. So it has to do with the file system and whatnot. But just note that NASs are one of these quirky things. Do your research before you go to the route of a NAS. And I put 2 quotes here. They come directly from Microsoft. And it just tells you, although you can save Access database file to OneDrive and SharePoint, we recommend that you avoid opening an Access database from these locations. The file may be downloaded locally for editing and then uploaded again once you save your changes. And that's true for pretty much any of those. If you don't have a choice, well, then you need to use that connection, whatever it may be, to copy it locally, work with it, and then copy it back. And that automatically implies no multi-user scenarios, because you can't each take a copy and then copy it back at a later point in time. You'll overwrite the other person's work. And that's why I say it's critical to have a LAN. The second quote, we recommend that you do not use Microsoft Jet over a WAN, over a modem connection, over FTP, or any less reliable network transport. This can increase the chance of database corruption. Yes, you're going to see people, oh, I use wireless, never had a problem. Oh, I use VPN, never had a problem. Most of the time, these are the people in the forums asking questions about database corruption. It's take it at your own risk if you want to go down those paths. If you do choose to use a less than recommended route, backup. Set up an automatic backup, religiously backup. So where does Access excel? What are its strengths? Well, one of its biggest strengths is just the multitude of backends that it's able to interact with, the different types of data that it can connect to. Think of text files, you think of Excel, Access Database, MySQL, Oracle, SQL Server, Azure, Dataverse, and the list just goes on and on and on. And that's what makes it so flexible. You can connect to anything and quickly be up and running with a reporting tool or even data entry. So it is unparalleled on that front. It has graphical designer, drag and drop, where you create a new form, a new report, and you just drag and insert controls. And you have dialogues that are there to define your properties with drop-down lists and things like that. You have a graphical query designer. So you can use the graphical approach, or you can also switch into plain text SQL statement creation mode. Reporting is simply unparalleled. The ease of creating reports is just astounding. It's one of its great strengths. Unlike if you think of SQL Server, if you think of MySQL, these other things, you don't have to set up a server with services and ports and all these different things to get Access functional. If we're talking about an Access backend and that, you just place the file in a central location, a central share, and it's operational. So basically, any user can create a multi-user database themselves with no intervention from the IT department, no database administrator per se. Low code, no code. Yes, I had to go there. Some people right now are glaring at me. It is true if we think of the drag and drop development approach. Some people imply that Access is a low-code, no-code, the original low-code, no-code development environment. Stay tuned for more on that. Support. Well, there are a multitude of forums out there where you can get pure support. You can get samples, sample databases, sample code. The amount of information on the web now about Microsoft Access is simply astounding. So you've got a wealth of documentation and information and sample databases to learn from. It extends to all of Office because of export functionalities, because of things like mail merge, because of VBA. You're able to use an Access database and interact with any other application you can think of, Word, Outlook, Excel, PowerPoint. The list goes on. It is one of its strengths there too, is what you're able to achieve by extending it beyond its own walls. Where does it fall short? Well, I'm going to start off with security. Although you can password encrypt the database, and that's glorious, the fact remains that even if you convert it over to an ACCDE, it is possible to do things as a user that a user shouldn't be able to do. Yes, there's all sorts of steps you can take. You can put all sorts of firewalls in place and, sticks in the spokes and try to slow people down. But realistically, at its core, there is a fundamental security issue. There's also, if you look at a programming side of things, there's a fundamental issue relating to something called the running objects table. Anyway, I'm not going to get into it here, but there's a whole security aspect. Now let's get back to the low code, no code. This fact remains that yes, although you can drag and drop and create a form and create some reports, they are going to be primitive. And to achieve anything, in my opinion, remotely usable, remotely professional, that is going to make people's lives easier, it requires code. There's no way around it. And I don't consider macros to be code. I don't consider those to be a viable solution or a professional solution either. It requires hard code VBA, whether you like it or not. That's the reality of access. So keep that in mind. Low code, no code. Personally, I don't think so. There's the LAN limitation. It needs to be on a hardwired local network. That's the reality of things. It's a limitation. Then we get into the fact that it is a tool that was developed back in the 80s. It's still, even though they did their little facelift in 2007, still largely feels like a tool from the 80s, an outdated interface. If we look at the SQL editor itself, I'm not talking about the query by design editor, but if we switch into SQL view, it's a text editor. It's the most privileged SQL editor I've ever seen in my life. Notepad++ does a better job than what we currently have. I look at something like the web browser control, which anyone that's seen my other videos or my blog know I use extensively. Well, it's outdated. And you can't use some of the advanced functions that are available on the web. They just don't work in Access's web browser control. There's no way around that. So there are limitations to what I'd even be able to achieve because I'm limited by the tools that are currently in Access. Multi-value fields, there's a whole slew of them, attachments. These are dangerous field types and should be avoided. This is what I was talking about a little bit when I talk about the things that'll drive a database to 2 gigs. Using attachments is one of them. Using things like multi-value fields are hiding properly normalized tables and things like that, which make upsizing, should you need to at a later point in time, impossible. Or maybe not impossible, but much more complicated. Charting. I've always disliked Access's charting. I find it confusing. It's limited. It definitely doesn't offer what it was supposed to offer. It doesn't come close to what Excel can do. So charting for me is a big one. Bugs. What can I say about bugs? Since Microsoft went down the road of click to run, the Office 365, which then was relabeled to Microsoft 365, has been disastrous for bugs. It is completely unstable. I don't know what they're going to do. They sure don't seem to be able to get a handle on the situation because it's been going on now for 5 years, maybe even longer. It must be longer, actually. I've had clients walk away from Access because of this. I've also had clients demand that I change their application, their solution away from Access, and I have. I've migrated a couple clients now over to PHP. And it's entirely due to bugs, and more bugs. Support, Microsoft support. Well, I'm going to blatantly say it. It doesn't exist. They come out with patches and fixes and updates and things like that. But that's automatic. There's nothing there that really is impressive. And if you compare it to different applications out there, whether it be private, third party, or open source, Listen, just recently I had an issue with a WordPress plugin, and it's a free plugin. I'm not even paying for it. I posted on the WordPress support about a problem I had, and within about an hour, I had support from them. I am an unpaying person, and I had that level of support. You try that with Microsoft. You won't get anywhere. If you don't supply a credit card and pre-authorize, I believe it's $500, you won't even get someone on the phone, let alone solve your problem. So, I laugh at people that say support from Microsoft because, in my opinion, it simply doesn't exist. The other weakness, it's a Windows desktop application. So this isn't running in the cloud. It's not going to run on Linux. It's not going to run on a Mac. It's not going to run in your cell phone. It's a Windows desktop application. And that's where it is. That's where maybe things will change down the road. We've been begging and pleading, and they've tried now, 3 times to webify it, and it's just been a horrible, and they tuck in their tail and walk backwards every single time. So keep that in mind. Yes, some of you are going to say there's different ways of getting it possibly to run here and there. There's convoluted tools, there's different, but at the core, it is a Microsoft Windows desktop. So keep that in mind. If you run a place where you have different OSs, well, then that's a huge red flag. So keep that in mind. What are the biggest issues? What do people have issues with when you look at novice developers? Well, the first one that comes to mind is a lot of people seem to think that they can take their Excel spreadsheet, drag and drop it into Access as a table, and just start working. And that just isn't the way Access is. Or should I say, it will allow it, it will never complain about it, but you or your users will not be getting the optimal experience they should be. They won't be getting the full potential out of Access that they should be. Access requires some thought from a development standpoint. You need to look at data normalization, the way you create your tables and build relationships, to ensure that everything that flows downwards from those tables is optimal and the best that they can be to optimize and make the best user experience possible. And just dragging an Excel spreadsheet into a table, you're not achieving that at all. And then people get frustrated and they start complaining about Access. It has nothing to do with Access. It has to do with not understanding proper database development. And that's the thing, Access is a database. Everyone thinks they're a database developer. And yes, because Access is somewhat of a much easier tool to use. You don't have to create SQL statements to create tables. You have a graphical interface, and you have a graphical interface for forms. So everyone thinks they can just quickly create tables and forms, and they're up and running. And it may not hit them right away, may hit them in a month, may hit them in a year, but they often run into major problems at a later point in time. And so much so where a lot of times by the time they come to this person like me, everything has to be redone from scratch. So they can lose weeks, months, years of development because it wasn't started off on the right foot. Okay, it's like anything else. The tables, the foundation, are the most important thing for supporting the rest of the structure. And that's why I put a simple quote: it takes 10,000 hours to truly master anything. Don't ask me where they got 10,000 hours, but it just illustrates, you can't just walk into a new tool and think you're an expert. It's not the way it works, and Access is the same. Sadly, many templates are just bad. They start novice developers off on the wrong foot. Let's see. Let's create a new database quickly here. I don't know, event manager. Let's see what the event management's like. Yeah, that's fine. Create it. Let's look at the event table. Look, right here. Spaces in the name, field names. That's a fundamental no-no. Anyway, description as a field name. I can go on, but it's just, I'm going to stop there. But as I said, so many of the templates that people use that are put out there for us to use are wrong. And those types of errors, like you're saying, oh, well, the space in the field name, I didn't want that. No, you don't. And then it causes problems later when you have to do development, when you do SQL statements, when you do VBA coding. That space is going to be a pain in your ass for the rest of the life of that database. So anyway, it goes beyond the scope of this discussion today, but many of the database templates are wrong. It's as simple as that. And been pointed out, and yet nothing is ever done to correct them. So then you have to try to rely, like I said, on forums and blogs and to get the right information and the right way of doing things to ensure the success of your project. And that's where I come to Microsoft doesn't listen and they're very slow. You just have to look at user voice and now their feedback webpage. How many years did we have user voice going? And how many of the suggestions, the top suggestions, were ever acted upon? You check my blog, you'll see the statistics. It's horrifying. Microsoft, they put up a great website, they put up a great show, but at the end of the day, where are they? When are they listening to their users? The numbers speak for themselves. And the other big issue with any database, any development solution is people aren't thinking long term. They often overlook where's this system going to be in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, and proper development to ensure that it will survive. That if I need to move this system, let's say like I did for a client, I needed to move it to Azure. And then I reconnected the database like that so people could use it beyond a LAN. And that's called creating a hybrid database. Well, my databases are set up. I don't use multi-value fields. I don't use attachment fields. So my database upsized to Azure was a breeze. You get, and I know factually of one person I'm thinking of right now, the entire database is multi-value fields. And he's got major issues with bloating and the size of his database, and he's screwed, to put it politely. At this point in time, there's no consideration for doing anything and cleaning things out and being able to upsize. It'd be a colossal task. So, that initial design, like I said, going back to the tables, it's going to nip you eventually if you don't listen to what some people, such as myself, are trying to tell you in advance. You may not always understand the why people tell you don't use multi-value, don't use attachments. It's because we have years of experience. We've seen where it leads. Anyway, listen to advice. I highly recommend it. There's a reason we're here telling you things. One thing I will say about attachments, just to step back for 1 second. When I say don't use attachments, I mean for external documents and things like that. But for the application itself, if you want to embed your icons for forms and things like that, we're talking a limited number. And you first optimized all the images that you're going to use, so they're reduced in size to the minimal that they can be. Well, then that's fine. You in an application, 20, 50, 100 small icons, that's no big deal. What I'm talking about is when you're attaching Word documents, PDFs, images, all these other things, videos. It's just your database will quickly grow and exceed that 2 gig. That's where the attachment, you have to be careful. The last thing I wanted to show you, just since we're in this whole thing about what do you need to know, I also have a web page about best practices. And this is also what you need to know when you're developing. So like I say, proper setup, proper settings, then proper things to do for tables, for forms and reports, for macros and VBA. Keep those in mind if you're going to go down the path of development. By doing this, you will drastically avoid any potential pitfalls, downfalls, and save yourself a lot of headaches and hassles in the long run. So that pretty much sums it up. Actually, we're running much longer than I thought we would. I hope this helps you guys out a little bit. Anyone that's considering Access, don't get me wrong, it is a great tool. It has so much power under the hood compared to many of its competitors. I really hope Microsoft starts listening. I really hope they start modernizing it. Give us a ribbon editor, give us a new SQL editor, update the web browser control. Start breathing some life into the product that has served people now for over 30 years. And thank you for watching. If you don't mind subscribing, give me a thumbs up. If you're in a position to promote my channel on social networks and forums, be greatly appreciated. And we'll see you in the next video. Take care.